Yes, I think we are live streaming now. Welcome back, everyone. We will now begin panel 3. Theme of the session is teaching and learning, and 4 presentations will be chaired by Professor Robin Shields from University of Bristol. Thank you very much, Robin, for joining and your support. Feel free to submit your questions using Q&A function, and we'll take the questions after each presentation. And I now hand over to Professor Shields to begin the session. Over to you.
Great. Thank you, Uma. Thanks to our speakers and thanks to everyone who's here today. Good morning, evening, or afternoon, as the case may be, and happy, sorry, Eid's over. So, well, hope you're all well. We have 4 exciting papers today, and I'm going to begin without any further delay because we want to make the most of the time. So these papers are all on the theme of teaching and learning. And our first paper is from Abhinav Ghosh at Harvard University with the title Learning Loss, Imaginaries and Discourses of Deficit in Indian Education During the COVID-19 Pandemic. So over to you, Abhinav.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen, and if any of you can just give me a thumbs up if you can see my slide. Perfect, cool, great. So hello, everyone. I'm going to be talking about, as Robin said, the learning loss, imaginaries, and discourses of deficit during the pandemic in education in India. So schools closed down last March, and since then there's been this constant discourse of learning loss that's been going on, right? Like it's been something that's been cited by policymakers, studied by academics, keeps on featuring in mainstream media headlines. And so I want to take this opportunity to actually deep dive into this idea of learning loss. And I want to begin by asking, what is it that's lost when we say that learning loss has occurred, right? And it's interesting that when we look at different conceptualizations of learning loss, there seems to be a lot of difference between how different stakeholders talk about learning loss. So some areas talk about learning loss as the loss of subject matter ability, in the sense where a specific reading skill or ability is affected. Some areas talk about learning loss as sort of this dip in future earnings of the current generation of students. Some areas also talk about learning loss as sort of the hit that a nationwide GDP might take in the future because of school closures. What's interesting is that despite these varied conceptions of learning loss tends to operate as this umbrella term that is driving policy and narratives as a singularity. And so moving from there, I guess my interest is in some of these numbers that I use to communicate learning loss. More specifically, I want to look at how is this idea of learning loss assembled through some of these numbers, right? So since schools closed, I think there was always this desire to capture the consequences of school closures, which I think over the time has ballooned into this idea of measuring learning loss. So these days, like whenever we look at learning loss being spoken about, there's a lot of rich quantitative data to describe that, but we find very few nuanced qualitative data that talks about learning loss, right? And to kind of discuss this assemblage further, I want to leverage this idea of co-production from the field of science and technology studies. It basically means that whatever is scientific or what we call as evidence is inherently entwined with the social, political, and cultural aspects of our lives. Facts or claims, like they do not simply exist out there, but they actually materialize through our subjective representations of things that we deem important. And so in the case of learning loss, I feel like depending on different stakeholders' perspectives of what they feel is to be prioritized in the area of education or learning, learning loss accordingly gets conceptualized. And so in these qualitative statements, I feel that learning loss is not measured or estimated by these stakeholders. Instead, whatever is measured by these stakeholders based on what they think is important, that becomes the very idea of learning loss. And so I actually want to look at 3 examples, like in no specific order, and it's not to highlight these specific 3 examples, but just as a representative set of the different kinds of numbers that I use to communicate this discourse. So in the first one, we see how percentages are used sometimes to talk about the extent of populations affected. In the second case, big monetary sums are spoken about to show the scale of learning loss. And we also have examples of comparative numbers being used to communicate learning loss. So something like 3 times of the US or 4 times of France, etc. Right? And it's interesting that all these numbers, different kinds of numbers, are used to communicate the same anxiety, the same sort of gravity of the situation. And this is nothing new because historically statistics have always been mobilized in different forms to communicate the gravity of a crisis, right? This might be any kind of ecosystemic crisis. There's something that Michelle Murphy refers to as phantasmagrams, essentially this idea that numbers have their own effective pull. And so Murphy gives this example of GDP. So for example, when the GDP as a number goes up for a nation, there's this collective sense of progress and security, as compared to when GDP goes down, there's this collective anxiety about economic insecurity, etc. And so I think learning loss expressed as numbers kind of fits the same bucket in the sense that these numbers, like when communicated through media, etc., they effectively convey the same kind of anxiety and hysteria that is supposed to act as a call to action. And so I think as educators and people interested in education, it is imperative that we critically examine some of these claims and numbers that are conjured. We ask further questions about how these numbers are made into being, how conceptualizations of learning loss are communicated, transported, and mobilized, what is made visible, what is hidden, who benefits, who loses, and what exactly it is that is lost from this idea of learning losses. And so just in the second part of my presentation, I just want to talk about the specific idea of learning within learning loss. I personally feel that in the learning loss discourse that has been prevalent for a while, I think there's a narrow perspective of learning in that whenever we kind of examine some of these learning loss discourses in public spaces, I think learning is kind of seen as only something that happens in schools, like in the sense that school closures equate to children not learning anything. There's also this idea of learning being necessarily seen from an economic perspective of being tied to salaries, GDPs, futures, etc. There's also this other aspect of where learning is predominantly seen as a cognitive process rather than the other aspects of learning, such as social, affective, cultural, are often overlooked. And unfortunately, as is always the case, almost always learning is seen as related to reading or mathematics. There's very little that is spoken about outside these ideas when specifically talking about learning loss. The other sort of problematic aspect that I want to highlight is this deficit view of children embedded in learning loss. And so this kind of originates from the very fact that since school closures, a lot of mobilization has happened to find out what have been the losses instead of identifying what have been gains. There's also this deficit paternalistic views of children that without schools, children cannot learn anything, which kind of places the entire onus of learning on schools and kind of takes away agency of learning from children in non-school environments. And I think also one aspect of problematization is sort of how marginalized children are spoken about in this discourse of learning loss as people more standing a more serious chance of losing out as compared to their privileged counterparts. And I think that kind of erases the historical structural inequities that have provided them a substandard quality of learning and kind of shifts the blame onto the pandemic as something that's caused that. And so I think both these aspects, the narrow perspectives of learning as well as the deficit views of children, they kind of present a lot of potential risks for both teachers and for children. For teachers, there's going to be this high expectations when schools reopen to cover up the syllabus and catch up and bring things back to where they were. And a lot of this is going to happen without a lack of significant training to handle post-pandemic education, whatever that might look like. And I think children are going to have it worse, where there's going to be an excessive pressure of learning fast, probably spending more time going to tuitions, etc., much more testing and evaluation to constantly monitor whether children are making the appropriate progress or not. And also rote learning in the sense that a lot will be expected to be covered in a very short time. And I think these not only present serious challenges to the learning experiences of children, but also to their mental health, especially emerging from a pandemic. And so it's imperative to ask that if children and teachers face so many risks from this idea of learning loss, who stands to benefit? Like just as a broad question, who might be benefiting from this discourse specifically, not the idea of learning loss, but the discourse of learning loss. It's important to ask who is creating and propagating this discourse. A lot of the source material we see on learning loss comes from economic institutions, edtech companies, private organizations, etc. And it is interesting how a lot of these specific stakeholders tend to benefit from this discourse in the form of government partnerships, rising stock prices, or key positions in decision-making and policy-making. I want to echo Williamson et al.'s work in terms of this, where they kind of see learning loss as intimately tied to sort of the industry's desire to capitalize on the anxiety, right? So the anxiety is induced in order to capitalize on it. And so just to close, I want to leave with a few thoughts on so what, right? Like, what do we do now? And I think it's important that we stop engaging with deficit loss perspectives and kind of put more asset-centered perspectives in education from our side, which would look not necessarily in terms of focusing on what was lost, but in terms of identifying learning gains that children might have had during this pandemic, right? Learning often happens without adult supervision for children, and kind of tapping into those and bringing back them into the classroom. It's also important to go beyond just reading and math abilities and kind of looking outside syllabi and curricula in terms of the learning children might have had during this period. I think it's also important to kind of recognize the kind of experiences children had during this entire 16-month duration with a pandemic raging on, and kind of engage with those experiences rather than completely erasing them and starting with a very decontextualized form of learning. I think just the last couple of points. One, it's essential that we kind of deprioritize the learning and cognitive loss as much as we are right now, and instead focus more on the social and emotional loss that children have had. And lastly, I feel instead of mandating things that teachers and children should do after the pandemic, it's incredibly humbling and equally essential to reach out to them and ask them, what can we do to help you? Because teachers and children will always be at a better place to answer what they need. So yeah, thank you so much, and I appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you, Abhinav, for a very insightful analysis of the discourse of learning loss, including what's being lost and who's gaining. We have a question from Nilesh. What kind of learning do you think the children from disadvantaged backgrounds had in your conception of learning in an Indian context, where more than half of the children lack are behind in grade-specific learning?
Thank you so much, Nilesh. Great question, and something that I consistently think about a lot. So I think there are a couple of strands here, right? Like, one is this idea of grade-specific learning. Sometimes we, especially for children from marginalized backgrounds, we tend to prioritize grade-specific learning over everything else. There's this deficit perspective that because these students lack specific grade level objectives or mastery levels, there is a need to first make them master that before we move to more advanced forms of learning. I think it's important to blend in sort of those grade level learning needs with a lot of rich learning experience. So a lot of marginalized children in our countries have experiences of their own, learnings of their own, living in specific settings and contexts that they are, which need to be tapped in. It should not be a situation where the minute students step into the classroom, we kind of shield off the communities, the backgrounds, the contexts they are coming from, and kind of provide learning that is completely originating in a textbook and not in their lived realities. So I can probably have a longer answer. I'm happy to take this outside this call as well in terms of what can be specific visions of this. But in short, I would say that there is a need to tap into the lived realities of these children more than ever and tie them into grade level learning standards.
Thank you, Abhinav. Great point. And we've got one more comment that you might wish to respond to. The point, Akanksha Awal says, your point about loss is well taken, but she wonders how the losses may be placed relationally. If everyone's suffering, then are students being compared to performance in the past, or is it more a question of establishing baselines? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and this is a tricky one, right? This is an excellent question, I think. And I think there's a couple of things here, at least in terms of what I feel. I think one is that it's not just a question of establishing baselines or comparative metrics in the past. I think there's this idea that, this K to 12 learning sequence, I think this sequential learning format is so deeply ingrained in our own, and by our, I mean all stakeholders in this case, in our collective thinking, that a 16-month school closure completely derails this trajectory, K to 12 trajectory in our heads, which creates this anxiety. So I think it's not just about pre-established baselines and comparative metrics, but I think a lot of this learning loss relationality comes from the derailing of this trajectory, right? I think this trajectory is something that can always be recalibrated, realigned based on where we are right now, instead of having that rigid notion. And right now, because we've made 16 months, doesn't make the entire schooling experience diminish. We can always recalibrate to have equally enhanced opportunities outside. I'm not sure if that completely answers your question, but that's probably a point I'll say in the interest of time.
Great, thank you, Abhinav, and please feel free to continue the conversations in the chat or by follow-up communication later. We're now going to carry on to Anwar Uddin Ahmed's paper. Anwar is at York University in Canada, and he will be presenting on temporal equity in education, an emerging priority in post-pandemic Bangladesh. Over to you, Anwar.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you everyone for joining this session. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on your time zone. My name is Anwar Uddin Ahmed, and in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to read selections from my paper. So I would like to acknowledge many scholars whom I have cited in my paper, but in the interest of time, I may not always read the long parenthetical citations. However, I will signal when I'm using direct quotations. And if anyone is interested in the full text of my paper, I'm happy to share after the conference. So without further delay, let me read some sections of my paper. So in this paper, I'm interested in the impact of COVID-19 on our sense of time and what it means for educational policy and practice. In popular media, we hear that the pandemic has altered people's sense of time. Being trapped at home, many of us are experiencing time in unusual ways. Some academics have already described this as temporal disintegration. So time is arguably the most valuable commodity in the neoliberal academic context. However, the role of time in school is more complex than following a timetable. As Sandra Gray wrote, time, and I quote, represents a highly structured and stratified element of social relations laden with meaning. It provides a framework for students and teachers to negotiate social status, locate social and cultural practices, and mediate mechanisms of power and control, unquote. Previous studies have shown how school time is based on the temporal perspectives of middle and upper classes, and how it fails to accommodate the temporal needs of marginalized communities. Now, my paper aims to contribute to this line of work on time and education. Although I use evidence from Bangladesh, the paper has implications for other South Asian countries and beyond. Now, like many other countries, the public health initiatives in Bangladesh have disrupted continuity from the past to the future and resulted in temporal disintegration for many students. Data published in recent reports and anecdotal accounts in electronic media suggest that prolonged school closure and indefinite delay in course completion have put students' future in question, created anxiety, and diminished their confidence. For example, a 13-year-old boy from Sylhet in Bangladesh said, quote, "I'm wasting my time in this period just doing nothing," unquote. In a BBC Bangla call-in show, a female undergraduate student expressed her anxiety and asked for advice to cope with her mental health challenges. She had a plan to graduate, find a job, and support her family. And now she said she had lost her race with time. Now, in the interest of time, again, I'm not reading all my examples, but one of my key findings is that a feeling of temporal disintegration is disrupting students' academic planning and personal well-being. Now, how do we go from temporal disintegration to temporal equity? To respond to this question, I begin with a historical observation that the invention of clocks not only provided people with a method of measuring time, but also altered their perception of labor and their relationship with each other. The clock was used as a technology of control and as justification for moral reformation of the working class. And the British historian E.P. Thompson's work can be noteworthy here. However, the mechanical notion of time promoted by the Industrial Revolution and the European colonialism did not find an easy acceptance everywhere. A good example is the destruction of the Crawford Market Clock Tower of Mumbai in 1898. In India, for example, clock towers not only promoted a British culture and identity, but they also sought to disrupt local cultural practice, work habits, and orientation to temporality. And people were angry about these clock towers. Now, let us return to the field of education. Modern education systems were designed to prepare, like it was one of the key goals of modern education system to prepare students as efficient workers to maximize productivity for capitalist societies. From the beginning, the schools experienced a temporal colonization, which legitimized a linear, impersonal, and measurable notion of time. And at the same time, it denied the existence of alternative temporal experiences of people in technologically and culturally diverse societies. Now, in contemporary literature on time and education, we can identify three dominant notions of time. Number one, clock time. Number two, socially constructed time. And number three, network time. So let me define them real quickly. So clock time. In this conception, time is understood as linear and quantifiable. It is calculated by using clocks and calendars, and it has an exchange value. People are expected to use time according to the economic principle of scarcity. Now, socially constructed time. This notion of time as socially constructed challenges the paradigm of clock time. Instead of looking at time as linear and objective, social time points to how temporal experiences vary according to sociocultural contexts. And lastly, network time, or which we can also call the virtual time. Now, this kind of time resulted from the advancement of digital technologies of information and communication. Network time calls for efficiency, and it orients us toward a more accelerated pace of life. It makes clock time less relevant. Now, network time figures prominently in technology-mediated educational activities. A popular trope is that students are now more empowered because thanks to the internet, learning can happen anywhere at any time. However, this view of temporal flexibility is simplistic and it can be oppressive. As Holden and Valencianos wrote, the anytime, any place approach to flexibility is based on, and I quote, an implicit assumption that all learners participate in and experience education in similar ways, unquote. Now, what do we need? I propose that we need a social time approach to policy and pedagogy. So we need to rethink education from the perspective of social time, because both clock time and network time promote neoliberal capitalist agendas that are discriminatory against economically and culturally marginalized communities. Now, sociological analysis has already shown that children from middle and upper classes are better prepared to respond to the temporal structures of schools. Because of their background, resources, and social capital, these children can relate their present to a stable future. However, this is not the case for children from working class backgrounds. Now, both clock time and network time promote the individualization of time. That is, the individual has a great amount of agency and therefore is responsible for utilizing time in productive ways. The pandemic of COVID-19 has pushed this tendency forward by making more space for asynchronous learning. As a result, we see a neoliberal framing of student agency and temporal flexibility, which ignores the contextual and relational nature of temporal experience. Now, social time can also be helpful to understand how temporality is entangled with various modes of oppression. People's experience of temporality is dynamic, which changes in accordance with economic, spatial, and cultural context. Therefore, I propose that individuals in charge of educational policy and practice consider the following three principles so that greater temporal equity may be achieved. Number one, the notion of temporal flexibility needs to be interrogated with pedagogical imagination because time is not equally flexible to all. Number two, temporal agency is contextual, relational, and distributed across actors. The students are part of a complex social ecology, and available resources will greatly influence their agency to utilize time. And finally, temporal experience is almost always mediated by such factors as socioeconomic class, geographic location, and gender identity. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Anwar. That was a fascinating and very insightful presentation and analysis. I think we can all agree, although it might be ironic, you used the time very effectively. So I'd like to suggest that we field any questions, comments, or reflections from members of the audience or fellow panelists. While we wait for some to come in, I have a question,
Sure.
Anwar. Which actors or organizations do you think are most active in structuring or shaping how we have come to think about time during this pandemic context?
Well, I think all the stakeholders like governments, school boards, teachers, parents, I think we all are thinking about time and then the loss of time along with the learning loss that Abhinav was talking about, because we're comparing this learning loss with the time loss, because we're trying to conceptualize how we will make it up, because the time that we are losing, especially from students and parents' perspective. So time is so crucial here. And then as we reconceptualize or reimagine education, post-pandemic, whenever that might be, we're thinking about how we will, or at least we should be thinking about how we should support our students and how much time we should give them. So how should we look at time? Should we use our calendar, like the clock time that I was trying to explain? So if we give them a time frame based on the clock time, is it equitable depending on the resources, their class, the backgrounds, resources, social capital? Will it be pedagogically equitable to follow the paradigm of clock time? That's why I was thinking perhaps we should also think about the socially constructed nature of time. So how much you can do within a given temporal framework,
Great, thank you. That answers my question well. We've got two questions that relate to pedagogy. So Navin has asked perhaps what pedagogical implications are there that arise from your presentation? And another question in the chat says, is there anything called pedagogical time? If not, do you think there should be one? And I think you've touched upon that a bit already, but would you like to say more on that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. These both questions are so interesting. So my sort of like the starting point is, yes, I'm thinking in terms of the sociological imagination, if you will. So how we should, so in pedagogy, and again, like by pedagogy, I do not mean like a one-way transmission of content from the educator to the learner. So I'm thinking about both-way communication. And a special kind of relationship between the teacher and the students. So in that sort of relationship, I think we need to think imaginatively, with care, and holistically as well. And so that our notion of this rigid temporality based on the clock is somehow, you know, perhaps, reconceptualized, so that we don't follow the clock all the time, and we reconceptualize time so that every learner, everybody, every teacher, and everyone else can learn and benefit from these pedagogical exchanges. But if we, on the other hand, if we follow the clock time, I think then we will not do our job properly, especially for the communities that have to grapple with so many other challenges due to the pandemic. So I think that's why I'm starting with this idea of pedagogical imagination, which is based on the idea of like Mill's idea of sociological imagination. And the other question about, sorry, I think we should wrap up. The other question about pedagogical time, I think there should be. And as educators, it is upon us how we work for that notion of pedagogical time. So I don't have a simple answer to that question, but I think that we all need to think about how we should think about pedagogical time, which is equitable and inclusive.
Thank you, Anwar. Very thoughtful reflections there. And sadly, we're out of time, but do keep the conversation going. Our next two speakers are from the Asian Development Bank. We're happy to welcome Natalie Chun and Elisabetta Gentile, who will be speaking on what educational inputs matter to improving learning. Natalie and Elisabetta, over to you.
Thank you so much. I hope you can all hear me. Actually, I will be presenting on behalf of my co-author as well, because she's in the US West Coast. So let me start without further ado. The motivation of this project was that, as we all know, the COVID-19 crisis has pushed education again to the forefront of the policy debate. But really, it has not brought anything new, any new challenges. Rather, it has exposed existing gaps in education systems. For a very long time, developing economies in particular have been exposed to a host of educational interventions. But governments and donors, because they are accountable for the way they spend money, they often focus primarily on observable measures of educational financing, the ones that are easily quantifiable, and also expansion in years of schooling. But the question remains, are these educational inputs, such as financing, really leading to an expansion in skills? So what we wanted to do with this project was to attempt a new approach to educational benchmarking that seeks to actually capture some quality dimensions of educational inputs and provide actionable evidence-based strategic priorities to improve learning outcomes. So what we will do in this paper, we started this in 2014. We conducted an in-depth review of the relevant applied microeconomic literature on educational interventions. And then based on that literature review, we developed, collected, and analyzed 171 indicators on basic and national level educational inputs in 69 economies. I think 18 of these economies are developing Asian economies, including South Asian economies. So needless to say, as economists, we are always worried about our identification strategy. So we have only one cross-section of data. So we were concerned with multicollinearity between input indicators. And we wanted to ensure that we had an identification in this very simple regression, So we try to combine input indicators into composite indices using a technique called common factor analysis. So using common factor analysis, we came up with two separate sets of composite indices. The first one is more of a high level set, and I will be showing this set for the sake of time. So this one, basically, whenever we had one indicator that had a factor loading higher than 0.5, we would just group all the indicators in the same section and include them in the composite. So this is a more high level set of indicators. The second set is more specific. So that basically, whenever a variable would come out of the common factor analysis with a factor loading higher than 0.5, then just that variable, just that indicator would be included. And we also imposed mutual exclusivity of indicators across different composites. So what are our learning outcomes in this exercise that we, against which we measure the effectiveness of educational inputs? Well, not surprisingly, we have test scores of 15-year-olds taking the PISA and TIMSS tests from 2003 to 2012. So we were able to construct an average science math score. We were able to construct an average test score also for children at the bottom 20% of socioeconomic status in the country. We also have additional control variables, which are the average years of schooling in those aged 25 to 65. And then we also had, of course, the country's GDP per capita. We are economists after all. So our baseline specification is your standard education production function. On the left-hand side, you have your learning outcome, again, your PISA or TIMSS score. It's your Y_IR, where I stands for economy, country, and R stands for region. And on the right-hand side, we have our vector of composite education inputs. Then we have our log GDP, we have our average years of schooling, and then we have our regional fixed effects and our term. So as we were mentioning before, we were very aware of the econometric challenge that this simple model poses, because we have a small sample of countries that we are observing only a single period of time. And so how did we go about identifying the separate effects of the different input indicators in a simple regression? Well, we conducted what we call pairwise regressions. So we basically run a regression for each pair of input indicators in the complete set. And then we took the average of the coefficients across the different regressions, where each regression is weighted equally and divided by the total number of indicators. And then we conducted the simulation. So how do we interpret these regression coefficients? One way to do this is to simulate what is the expected change in the outcome variable from rising an indicator from the average, from the level of the average five bottom tier countries to the top tier 5 countries. And here's what the simulation gives us. So let's begin with the whole sample. What you see, again, for the sake of time, I will focus only on the first column, which shows you the simulated increase in PISA or TIMSS test scores, which is given by increasing a level of an education input from the average of the bottom 5 economies to the average of the top 5 economies. And what you will find, the first one, unsurprisingly, the most significant one is the one that leads to the most significant increase is a gross enrollment ratio in secondary school. Well, that's not surprising because guess what? It's a bunch of 15-year-olds who are taking these tests. So of course, their enrollment ratio in economy is going to matter. But the ones that come after are quite interesting because you can see, for example, for career guidance, the simulated increase in test scores from going from the level of career guidance that is present in the bottom 5 economies to the level of career guidance in the top 5 economies yields to an increase in test score by 60 points. I didn't show you any summary statistics, but that's a 13% increase in the average test score for the economy. So it's pretty impressive. And then you see that policies for strategic budgeting, again, going from the bottom 5 average, the top 5 average, yields a test score increase of 44 points, and then 40 points for for teacher quality, 40 points for curriculum content, and 41 points for information collection. When we look at the lower 20% socioeconomic status, we see that, of course, the simulated increases are not the same, but again, the top 6 indicators are pretty much the same. And this leads us to reason a little bit on what this very simple exercise tells us. So first of all, we see that gross enrollment in secondary school, career guidance, strategic budgeting, teacher quality, data-driven decision-making, and curriculum content are significantly associated with higher levels of learning outcomes. But conversely, the more mainstream indicators, which have been seen over and over again in the literature, again, focusing on government expenditures and student-teacher ratios, are really not associated with the higher learning outcomes. So what do these results tell us mainly? That information collection, sharing, and strategic action based on this information have the highest impact on skill outcomes in an economy. I mean, this is impressive. I was able to stay within the allocated time. So I hope that we can use this time to start a conversation and to discuss, what to do with this information for building back better in a post-pandemic developing Asia. So thank you very much, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Elisabetta. That was a very interesting, timely, and insightful presentation. It raised lots of questions for me, and I'm sure for people in the audience too. While we wait for questions to come in, I have one for you. If you can speculate a bit, I suppose one of the inputs which has been affected the most in the pandemic is just attendance of schools or schools being open. And that's probably very hard to measure in your analysis because it's been constant until now. Are there any thoughts on how we might try to measure that and place it within your framework in the future?
That's actually a very good suggestion. As I mentioned, this project started before the pandemic, a couple of years before the pandemic. And actually, there have been international organizations such as UNESCO, if I'm not mistaken, that have engaged in this painstaking exercise of gathering data on school closures in a number of developing economies. And this data is actually at the basis of the analysis that Abhinav was discussing at the beginning of the section, where economists and other researchers were trying to quantify the so-called learning losses. Definitely this is something that could be done. And the only concern that I would have about that is that perhaps we would have to reevaluate the timing of the data collection. We might have to do another round because then we might have a mismatch, especially given again that there has been a lot of activity, especially in developing Asia, in terms of educational interventions to try and improve learning outcomes, because even before the pandemic, as we all know, there was a learning crisis ongoing, and we are expecting this crisis, unfortunately, to get deeper as a consequence.
Great, thank you. And we have a question from Navin. If financing and teacher-student ratio does not affect students' learning outcomes, then how do you relate them with learning? I suppose, how are they important?
That's a really good question. So again, I will give you a very standard economist question answer that some of us may not like, but often increasing the national education budget does not necessarily lead to improvements in learning outcomes unless this money is spent efficiently, is allocated efficiently. And how do we know how to allocate this money efficiently? We need some kind of exercise, systematic exercise. I did not have time to go through other similar initiatives that exist, but the point is really to try and understand, we have scarce resources, where should these resources go? So just looking at the percentage of the national budget that goes to education and just looking at increasing that is no guarantee that that's going to trickle down into learning outcomes, unless we know how to where to put this money, on what to put these resources.
Great, thank you. And one more question I think we have time for from Krishna Adhikari. How do your research outcomes compare with findings in other regions, if there are similar researches? And I'll add one of my own. You had some regional fixed effects. How different are they? And is your model constant across regions?
That's a really good question. So unfortunately, we tend to not include the fixed effects in our tables, because otherwise they would be ginormous tables. But yes, there are some regional differences. And I think the prior two speakers, I think especially Anwar, has pointed to some cultural and systematic differences that could be coming into learning outcomes, especially if an education system does not take such differences into account. So I have been in Asia going on 10 years now, in developing Asia in particular, and one concerning trend, and when as Anwar was presenting, that's immediately what came to mind. One concerning trend that I'm looking at is that many developing Asian economies are reforming their school calendars to match Western European countries, or to match North America or something like that. That of course has some advantages, but the early evidence is already showing that there are some disruptions that this is bringing to the local economies. So we can think of regions that are more affected than others based on these structural factors. So again, education is a very frustrating field to be in, because there are so many different inputs and so many moving parts. But I think this is definitely one element that I would look into.
Great. Thank you, Elisabetta, for a fascinating presentation, and I hope to hear more of your analysis in the future. We are now moving on to our fourth and final, but by no means least presentation. Mythili Ramchand and Meera Chandran from the esteemed Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai will be presenting on teachers and teacher education, policies, preparation, and the pandemic in Bhutan, India, and Sri Lanka. So Mythili and Meera, over to you for the next presentation.
Thank you so much, Robin. And we've asked our presentation to be shared on screen because we are facing some unstable internet connectivity here. So yes, as you can see on the screen, our presentation today is titled Teachers and Teacher Education, Policies, Preparation, and the Pandemic. Next slide, please. Next slide, yes. We begin with outlining the global discourse on teachers that has framed teacher education structures and policies in specific ways. We present a brief review of the ways in which the ongoing pandemic has impacted the sector, the policy response or lack thereof, and some voices of teacher educators. We then analyze the structure of teacher education in the three countries that overlay the local history, politics, and society, and further shape the policy response to the pandemic. Next slide, please. The work of teachers, their preparation and continuous development, often framed in terms of teacher quality, has received heightened attention in recent years globally. This has had profound influence on policy in the region. Teachers are seen on the one hand as technicians characterized by shorter duration for their preparation with a focus on efficiency and accountability, and on the other hand as professionals with rigorous preparation, autonomy, and self-regulation. This has implications for policy formulations, regulation, and practice. We use this conceptualization as a frame to understand the way in which the pandemic has impacted the sector and to analyze the policy responses and possibly even the way forward. The next slide, please. A very brief review of literature and media reports on the ongoing impact of the pandemic on the sector tells us that teachers' roles have been further undermined in these three countries. Clearly, the South Asian region has been severely impacted by school closures, sudden movement to an online mode of teaching that schools and teachers were unprepared for, UNESCO study shows that only 39 to 60% of teachers were required to teach in these countries, and learning losses are most severe in South Asia. Nearly all students in Bhutan are severely impacted by the pandemic, particularly in rural areas. Teachers are reportedly leaving the profession. In India, the existing inequities are further exacerbated, with poor and rural students being hard to reach through the online mode. Over 100,000 teachers have reported job losses, and 30 to 40% are working for reduced pay. In Sri Lanka too, a lack of digital preparedness or curricular adaptation has exposed students to learning losses, and there is unrest among teachers due to pay cuts. State response has been weak at best, with mostly centralized ICT-based solutions in the form of online learning platforms being offered in India and Sri Lanka in particular. And school education budgets have been cut in India and Sri Lanka as well. We were able to conduct a few interviews with teacher educators from different parts in India to provide a view of experiences from the ground. We see some variation in their perspectives, ranging from more positive experiences of adapting quickly to the online mode to anxiety with regards to lack of human connect that has compromised meaningful learning for student teachers. Internships and practice teaching in particular were a major challenge, but they were also able to use mentorships and collaborations with school leaders in a strategic way to support their students. These teacher educators are calling for greater autonomy, curricular revival, focusing on community connect and research-based internships. Over to you, Mythili.
Meera?
Yes, over to you.
Yeah, so may we have the next slide, please? The slide after that. Yeah. So, the previous one, sorry, the historical, political, and social context. So, as we have seen in the previous two slides, the states have not proactively reached out to teachers' needs during the pandemic. And of course, there is some shared history among the three countries, but different political and social context exist in the three countries, but the structures are remarkably similar. And the response to the pandemic and emerging discourse is also aligned. So all three countries have recently come up with a new national education policy. In fact, in India, moving on to the next slide, the policy was brought out during the pandemic, but it is completely silent about the pandemic and its effect. So looking at the specifically context of teachers and teacher education, we find that deeply entrenched hierarchical systems in all the three countries, and with teachers occupying the lowest rung. And additionally, in India, when we move on to the provisioning of teacher education, in the next slide, please, there appears to be no cross-learning in the region. So Bhutan has recently moved away from the 4-year teacher education program, since the country found that the content knowledge was inadequate in the integrated teacher education program of the graduates, while India is precisely moving in the other direction, from a concurrent program to a consecutive one of 4-year duration. And if we look broadly at the aspiration for the profession in all the three countries, we find that teaching is not aspirational at all, despite the fact that the salary of teachers, at least in the state-run schools in all three countries, are comparable to other graduates of the same nature. So moving on, you need to move on 2 slides further. Sorry about this. Yeah. So when we look at the policies, there is a tension in policies between the two extremes of teacher conceptions that we began the presentation with. So on the one hand, while acknowledging the need for professional preparation, On the other hand, there is centralized policy making and bureaucratic structures to monitor teachers' work operating from short-term technicist ideas. And recently, in the past 5-6 years, there has been a shift from regulatory mechanisms to accountability measures such as standardized student teaching and professional standards for teachers and public reporting of both school as well as the teacher education institutions' performance. So Bhutan has already formulated a professional standards for teachers, although it has not been mandated as yet in the country, while India and Sri Lanka are furiously in the process of doing so. The next slide, please. So in the current context of policies and the regulatory frameworks, they have been detrimental in the best of times, and in the post-pandemic context, it is absolutely essential that the policies are able to reimagine themselves. It's not just the teacher education alone that can bring about changes, but concomitantly the policies and the regulatory frameworks as well as the legislations have to support such change in teacher education. So we have been hearing in the conference repeatedly that addressing mental health and well-being of teachers as well as students is important. While states are accepting the need for addressing these issues among students, the same is not forthcoming with respect to teachers. The state is viewing teachers in all three countries instrumentally in its response and does not address their emotional well-being. And this should be the first step in building trust among teachers. So in lieu of the highly regulated and standardized teaching programs that the policies of all three countries are recommending, autonomy to local universities is required. As the interviews with the practitioners has also stressed. The national mentorship program, for example, of the new education policy in India has recommended the creation of a pool of mentors. And this belies what we know about the practice in teacher education from research, as well as the COVID response itself in various states in India. So it's distributed leadership and efforts to make that more conducive, that is essential. So strengthening community connect. So as one of the practitioners told us, we are the ones who are able to understand the context better and specific needs of our students best, and hence greater autonomy in coming up with creative solutions responsive to the specific needs of our students is essential, whereas that kind of flexibility is not present for the practitioners. So to end, education is a human endeavor, and bureaucrats and policymakers must recognize the strong human relations in the larger context of life and living that frame this endeavor and move policies in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Meera and Mythili, for a very comprehensive and insightful presentation. I think you've drawn our attention to a very important, and I think we might agree, often overlooked element of government responses to the pandemic in education. So thank you for that. We have a few questions coming in quite quickly. Nilesha says, you have taken teachers as a homogeneous category. Would you like to comment on the difference between state and private teachers, especially teachers in low-fee private schools? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you're right. So because the presentation was rushed, keeping in mind the 10-minute duration, we were not able to bring out the differences in the categories among teachers. And definitely, as we mentioned in passing, the salaries of teachers, for example, in government-run institutions is way higher than the salaries that teachers draw. Almost 20 to 25 times higher than what the teachers draw in private schools in the case of India. In Bhutan and Sri Lanka, you do not have that much of a difference because there are very few private schools in these two countries anyway. But in India, yes, the context of teachers in these two sectors are very different. And as Meera pointed out in the earlier slide, the number of teachers who have been losing jobs are in the private sector, and the percentage of teachers who are taking a pay cut is also much higher in the private sector.
Great, thank you. And Sonam, I think, is challenging us with a question specific to Bhutan about the percentage of teachers who might be leaving the profession during the pandemic, in case you might have any insights or knowledge on that.
I can respond to that, Mythili, very quickly. So we have not been able to find very robust statistics on this yet. So we are largely relying on grey literature or media reports at best so far. So we are still going to continue with our literature review and come out with a paper. So we'll keep you posted.
Thank you again to both of you for a very important and detailed paper and presentation. So we're looking forward to hearing more about that paper in the future, Meera. I think we are out of time now. I would like to just use the last minute to thank very sincerely all our speakers for very dynamic, diverse and insightful presentations. I think these went together very well in terms of looking at how teaching and learning are happening in the pandemic. We had Abhinav and Anwar kind of questioning some of our assumptions of the underpinnings of how we understand concepts like learning loss or the time and how our conception of time has changed in the pandemic. And we had Elisabetta, Meera and Mythili giving us very practice-informed, useful and insightful analyses of how systems work and how they can be structured in ways that support learning. So thank you to all of you for your time and your intellectual drive. Also, thank you to our participants for engaging questions, and of course, to the organizers for planning and facilitating this session. I'm aware it's quite late now for some of us, quite early for the others of us, but we have to let those of us in Asia probably get off to eat something or maybe even get to bed. So thank you again all, and I hope there's a chance for many of us to meet in person in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much to all the presenters for that wonderful series of presentations. And thank you, Professor Shields, for chairing this session for us today. This brings us to the close of day one of this conference, and we look forward to welcoming you tomorrow at 9:50. We start the session, the first roundtable with introduction, and we will have 2 more roundtables and 4 paper presentations tomorrow as well. And we also have performance by young South Asian spoken word poets tomorrow for the closing session. So please do stay with us till the end. It promises to be very good. So hope you enjoyed the day today and see you all tomorrow. Bye.